Over to you guys.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining today. We're going to start. My name is Natalie, and we're going to start by giving an overview of the report. Next slide. So this year we had launched on November 29th, the Energy Efficiency Market Report for 2023. Here we have a couple examples from the last couple of years that we've done. However, this year we really took a focus on a couple of different relevant and timely trends. We did a little bit more work on tracking progress and having some indicators that we'll talk about later, as well as going a little bit more in depth into some special focus topics such as heat waves and systems efficiency. So looking at recent trends in energy efficiency markets, we talk about energy intensity and demand, something you might have heard about in the recent COP discussions. Energy prices and affordability, also left over from some of the ongoing issues with the energy crisis. Sector and system-wide trends through all the different sectors, things like industry, buildings, transport, appliances, investment and employment policies, as well as policy progress updates with case studies from countries around the world. Then we dove into a couple of different key issues facing policymakers. So these ones were a little bit more commentary style. And this is the second part of the report that looks more at things like energy intensity and progress and why it's been slower this year, how we can achieve doubling, and then looking also at things like heat waves, energy crisis in gas and residential heating, and system efficiency, and a little bit of a deep dive on India. Next slide. So we did see some positive policy outcomes this year, and looking at minimum energy performance standards, which is one of the key policy, one of the strongest energy efficiency measures that we have. Minimum energy performance standards, we've seen them here across several different end uses, and we found that there's a good global uptake of minimum energy performance standards. And this year, there are now MEPs in more than 110 countries worldwide, including all the largest energy consumers. Generally, as the IEA recommends, these are also in line with having energy labels for consumers, which are also available in over 100 countries. And looking at these MEPs, we've also found that there have been other kind of positive aspects coming out of energy efficiency and electrification. We're looking at the peaking of fossil fuel use, something that we brought into this market report, which we haven't always looked at in previous market reports. And in mature markets, the IEA analysis shows that overall natural gas demand has already peaked, with a global peak expected for overall natural gas demand by 2030. One of the major drivers for this is from changes in residential heating through improved efficiency and electric heat pumps. We'll dive down into that a little bit more later. We have 34 out of 78 countries covering 50% of residential gas demand in major heating markets that have already experienced a plateau or decline in demand. We also looked at passenger cars, and the use of gasoline is also peaking in countries representing 60% of demand. And we expect gasoline demand to be peaking in 2023 overall. Next slide. While we do see good policy momentum, we also see that energy intensity progress is slowing. So looking at energy intensity progress, it came out as 1.3% this year. This has been primarily driven by increasing global energy demand, which significantly affects this indicator. Which rose by 1.7% in 2023, up from 1.3% last year. And this brings us back below the long-term average for energy intensity of around 1.7% for the last decade. This slower progress comes as global momentum is building around a target for doubling the rate of energy efficiency progress, trying to get it from 2 to 4%. And you can see that that has come up, as we'll talk about a little bit later, this has come up in some of the COP negotiations, and it's something that we're pleased to be supporting. These are the levels that need to be reached to reach the IEA net zero scenario. So let's take a minute here just to break down these three light blue bars we see on the right hand. And these are the three kind of energy efficiency, kind of energy scenarios that the IEA uses. So if we look at how that breaks down in practice, it shows them at just over 2, 3, and 4% respectively. These levels of energy efficiency progress will determine whether global energy demand will be in kind of a low, high, or medium energy demand scenario. So first, let's look at 2%. This is what we call the STEP scenario, or the stated policy scenario. And this looks at expectations based on current policy settings. So a bit of your business as usual scenario. And this sees energy demand rise by around 1% per year. The second scenario, the announced pledges scenario, or APS in IEA terminology, is based on announced but not yet enacted climate pledges made by governments. So this is 3% energy intensity progress and sees energy demand stabilize at around current levels this decade. The third scenario, the scenario that we're hoping for, is the net zero scenario, and that's consistent with 1.5 degrees of global warming this century. And this sees energy intensity improvements of 4%, driving an overall fall in energy demand of about 1% per year. And the important thing to remember is that the doubling objective to be in line with this net zero scenario is every year until 2030 and not by 2030. So every year that we miss that goal, we have to do even more the next year. And all three of these scenarios happen while the global economy grows at around 3% per year this decade. Next slide. So in this report, we also look at some of the reasons why there's been slower global progress, including policy time lags. So the time for some of the policies that have been implemented, the very good policies that have been implemented in many places in the last year or two to take effect, as well as, very importantly, structural trends towards larger homes and cars. But here we see that there's also regional drivers behind this year's global energy intensity result of 1.3%. And this brings us to another key message. It's that global progress is masking some exceptional progress in some countries and regions. We see, for example, this year that the US and European Union as a whole will have energy intensity gains of 4 and 5% respectively. And there were some countries we break it down within the report, and we can see there are some countries such as the Netherlands that have had exceptionally strong progress this year. Since the crisis began, around 40 countries have matched or exceeded 4% global target level. This includes countries such as Turkey, Korea, and the UK. Next slide. Here we've also looked at some of the special topics. So the world has recently endured its hottest summer on year on record, causing thousands of deaths, wildfires, and disruptions in sectors like agriculture and tourism. For this reason, we decided to take a special focus on this in this report. And we've also seen power grids hit record levels of peak demand in more than 10 countries around the world, including China, the US, India, Brazil, Canada, Thailand, Malaysia, and Colombia. And these together account for more than 60% of total global energy demand. Extreme heat puts severe strains on electricity systems, and we've seen some systems that have had to make power cuts or restrictions, including in Argentina, Egypt, India, Vietnam. And these increased cooling needs that come from these heat waves can also often mean that grid operators have to, especially at peak demand times, bring older, inefficient, more polluting power plants online to cope with the spikes in demand. Currently on the supply side, to meet peak demand, what we have is pumped hydro and thermal energy production, which can be turned up and down. And especially those thermal sources, many of them are very polluting. So for instance, in June 2022, Sichuan in China experienced extensive power restrictions, and in May 2023, Sichuan China subsidiary recorded its highest purchases of coal for power generation in several years. These higher temperatures have a significant impact on electricity demand, and here we look at air conditioning in particular, cooling demands for this. And so here we took a little bit at two different cases. One is the case of Texas in the US, which has a high household rate of air conditioners ownership, and India, which has a lower air conditioner ownership. And here what we see in this slide is that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in the average daily temperature above 24 degrees drives a rise of about 4% in electricity demand in Texas. On India, where air conditioner ownership is lower, the same temperature increase still drives a 2% gain. Next slide. So in addition to air conditioning, what we've seen is a shift to larger vehicles, some of these structural shifts we talked about earlier. And this year we see how transformations underway in the transport sector give some of the best optimism for energy efficiency going forward. In the left-hand side, we see that over the last 10 years, the efficiency of cars has increased by almost 20%, which is good news. And this occurred even as the size and weight of vehicles increased, with the share of SUVs in new vehicle purchasing behavior going from around 1 in 5 cars to almost 50% of all new cars purchased. We also found that transport efficiency would have gone a lot faster otherwise without this shift to larger cars. In the right-hand chart, we can see the relationship between vehicle weight and fuel consumption per 100 kilometers. One interesting feature of our analysis this year is to show the difference in fuel consumption between internal combustion engines and electric vehicles. So we see here that electric vehicles does increase with the weight, but not as much, not as drastically as internal combustion engines. This means that electric vehicles are still offer great levels of efficiency that may counteract some of the negative effect of this shift to larger vehicles. Next slide. We've also seen a shift towards more intensive consumption, which has driven growth. So in some fast-growing regions, we have more and bigger homes being built, which are canceling out some of the improvements in building energy efficiency technology. In the UK, for example, here we have the example of the UK and Brazil. In the UK, for example, over the last decade, even as population grew and housing stock grew, energy efficiency gains meant that overall energy consumption in buildings declined by 10%. By contrast, in Brazil, we've seen a structural shift away from multifamily dwellings, leading to new types of housing patterns. And this canceled out the energy and efficiency gains being made. It's important to note here, though, that in the UK, per capita energy use in the residential sector is still more than 4 times that of Brazil. But what we're comparing here is the different dynamics at play in energy efficiency. This is where we see where ongoing structural change, particularly as emerging and developing economies grow in socioeconomic terms, may lead to increases in larger homes, larger cars, as well as more higher use of end uses such as air conditioning, and these will put further strains on energy consumption. Next slide. I'll shift over here. We're going to turn into the second section, looking more at how this affects consumers, some of these broad trends, and I will shift here over to my colleague, Jack.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and thank you to Sam and the Users TCP Secretariat for inviting us to speak today. It's really good to speak to you all, and it's good to see some familiar names in the attendee list as well. So hello, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other messages of some of the key messages of our market report. So namely, how prices have affected users across the course of the energy crisis. And of course, their effect on energy efficiency trends and behavior change as well. Obviously, this is the year after we have seen some record-breaking price rises in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we've been tracking progress on that very closely, both in last year's market report, and we wanted to look at it this year as well. I'll also talk, as Natalie mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about this global target to double energy efficiency progress this decade as well. So one of the key messages of this report is that the effects of the energy crisis are still very much with us, and that this is having a strong effect on global energy intensity that Natalie's been talking about. So in Energy Efficiency 2022, or last year's market report, we reported that Russia's invasion of Ukraine sparked record increases in energy prices worldwide, and that led to consumer price inflation at very high levels, as we can see in the light blue bars here on the right-hand side. Now, this pushed millions of consumers into energy poverty. It drove drastic reductions in energy demand in households and industry, and drove energy prices up across the board. In this year's market report, we showed that while commodity prices for wholesale gas, coal, oil, electricity, for example, in nearly all cases, they have dropped significantly this year from their 2022 peak levels. Now, this is a very welcome development, but for a range of reasons, consumers in most cases aren't yet enjoying the full benefits of this price reduction. In some cases, and in some markets, we've seen that energy prices have started to come down over the past 12 months. That's consumer energy prices. And we can see that from the top set of dark blue bars here. But in nearly all cases that we looked at, those prices haven't dropped to the pre-crisis levels. And in fact, in many countries we're seeing, and in many markets we're seeing, that energy price inflation has continued to be positive this year, which means that prices have continued to rise. And that means consumers in many markets are paying even more now than they were in 2022. And this just shows you, this reiterates my point. This shows the IEA's estimates of household energy expenditure per dwelling between 2021 and 2023, and that's assuming constant levels of energy consumption. So this is just purely a price effect. And what we see here are the total effects of retail prices on household energy expenditure. So we're talking about essentially gas and electricity bills here for consumers. We're not talking about transport fuel bills, because the dynamics there are slightly different. But we see that in most of the affected countries, retail energy prices are still somewhere between 20 and 50% higher than they were before the crisis, even though, as I mentioned, some of the pressure has come off through lower commodity prices this year. Because we know that lower commodity and wholesale prices, they can take a little while to feed through to lowering household energy bills. And that's for a variety of reasons. You might think about energy supplies using long-term contracts, for example, or government support schemes that we've seen being enacted over the past 12 to 18 months winding down, and a variety of other reasons, which I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A session as well. But I just mentioned those government support schemes, and that was another key area of focus for us this year. So in response to the crisis, we've seen governments deploy record levels of spending to help shield consumers and industries facing soaring prices. And the IEA has been following these spending patterns very closely. So we saw that as of June this year, over $900 billion had been spent by government, or allocated at least by governments, mainly in advanced economies, as we can see, and predominantly there in the European Union as well. And the purpose of this was to either subsidize consumer energy bills or other measures to shield consumers. And we saw $270 billion allocated between November last year and April this year. Now, we've looked as well at the targeting of this spending, and we've seen that only 25% of this spending is targeted towards a specific income group, whether that's a specific group like a low-income group, for example, or social housing tenants or energy-intensive industries. The rest of this spending, 75%, wasn't targeted towards a particular group. And we find that the issue of transitioning, that's an issue for transitioning towards more structural efficiency improvements versus these short-term affordability measures. That's a very important consideration going forward. We at the IEA, we've certainly in the energy efficiency market reports, we've advocated targeted spending measures in response to energy price shocks, not only because it's more cost effective for public budgets, but because it tends to be more progressive in nature. And it retains an incentive for consumers to reduce their energy demand or to use energy more efficiently as well. And even more effective than that, we find, is spending that reduces structural energy demand. So that's things like spending on building retrofit programs, because this locks in those long-term energy savings, and it makes economies and consumer household budgets more resilient to future price shocks. Of course, there are time dynamics when we talk about this, and these structural spending programs can take time to feed through to actual real energy savings. But that just highlights for us the importance of long-term energy efficiency programs to anticipate these future shocks. So in addition to direct spending on price controls, we've seen governments increasingly turn towards behavioral insights to improve the effectiveness of policy. And that includes a large number of energy behavior and awareness campaigns that we've seen deployed over the past 12 to 18 months as well. We know that a better understanding of behavior can help encourage, for example, insulation or heat pump uptake. It can increase policy compliance, and more broadly, it can convince citizens to adopt energy efficiency measures and practices. We saw, for example, more than 20 behavioral campaigns launched in the early stages of the crisis. And we've looked at various characteristics of these campaigns. We've looked at things like key messages. We've looked at things like media across which those messages have been transmitted, and we've looked at the messengers as well, among other things. And we found that, for example, with those messages, the motivations behind those campaigns, we find that the most prevalent campaign messages include around affordability, sustainability, but also energy security. And the actions that those campaigns were suggesting are often linked directly to those motivations. We found that most campaigns initially, after the onset of the crisis, offered sets of low-cost practical tips, such as turning down thermostats, behavioral shifts like having shorter showers, colder showers, those kind of things. But as time progressed, we found an increasing focus on structural energy efficiency measures, such as adopting insulation and heat pumps. And just to say that since June of this year, the IEA has been coordinating with the users TCP, the campaign exchange task. And that's developing best practices in campaign design through a survey of all campaigns since the start of the energy crisis. So a big thanks from the IEA, both to Users TCP Secretariat and to the governments involved in this task. So that's what governments have been doing to try to affect behavior, and we wanted to try to see what the effects of those behavior change campaigns were as well. We know that measuring the direct effects of a campaign on actual energy savings is very challenging. It requires, disentangling lots of different behavioral effects, lots of different confounding factors. But when we found this nice case study here. We analyzed data on French electricity consumption, and we found evidence, at least, that behavior change campaigns can have significant effects. So here we see peak electricity consumption was around 6% lower on a cold day in 2023 compared to a similar day in 2019. And that suggests to us that recommended energy saving measures have been having an effect. And going forward, of course, tracking and monitoring these effects in a more formalized way is an important challenge, both for governments and the IEA as well. So I want to move now to talk a little bit about this global target to double energy efficiency progress that Natalie's described for us very well. This is, of course, a very live topic. We've had the COP28 global stocktake text released today. But just to kind of take you back a little bit, both the IEA Executive Director and the European Commissioner the European Commission have been calling for a global target since spring of this year and even earlier, alongside a target to triple global renewables capacity by 2030. And both of these targets together formed two of the IEA's 5 pillars for a successful COP. As mentioned, we had the COP28 text this morning. We are very pleased to have seen this global doubling target as part of that. We initially saw it about a week and a half ago in the early days of COP28 as part of this global renewables and energy efficiency pledge. So alongside text on the renewables tripling target, we had text committing signatories to double the global average annual rates of energy efficiency improvements from around 2% to over 4% every year until 2030. And we had this put the principle of energy efficiency as the first fuel at the core of policy making as well. So this is really a very historic outcome for COP. We're very pleased to have seen this. It's not only in the COP text, we've seen not only the first mention ever of fossil fuels in the outcome text itself, but we've had an explicit acknowledgement of the goal to double energy efficiency progress this decade. So that's a very significant moment for energy efficiency. So that's kind of what we've managed to achieve, but just to bring it back a little bit, what does the doubling involve? Well, Natalie's already outlined that doubling energy efficiency progress means doubling the global rate of energy intensity improvement from 2022's level of 2% every year to, or across this decade, to 4% on average. And we saw early political appetite for the doubling target at the IEA's 8th annual global conference on energy efficiency this year, early in Versailles, where we had 46 governments endorse the Versailles Statement, which called for stronger policy action on energy efficiency towards a goal of doubling progress. Just to say, this is obviously a global target. Some countries are already closer to that 4% threshold, but efforts are needed by every nation towards the global goal. And of course, we've had agreement from all of the UNFCCC parties now towards that goal. Part of the analysis that we included in this year's energy efficiency market report was about this doubling target and exactly what it means, what it entails for governments trying to move towards this goal. And one of the messages that we were able to give was that we know that doubling is difficult. You know, it's a doubling by its very nature is difficult, but we have been tracking. We have very good data on country level energy intensity progress over the past 10 years. And from our tracking, we can see how often individual countries have met that 4% threshold already, which shows us that there's very good examples to look for towards. In fact, we know that from the data we have, we see that since 2012, almost all of the countries that we looked at have already improved energy intensity by 4% or more in at least 1 year in the past 10. And more than half of those countries that we looked at did so at least 3 times. And obviously, the challenge now is for governments to meet that benchmark consistently. So what does it entail actually meeting that goal? We know that governments will need to make effort across all fronts. And as Natalie outlined, the pathway to doubling is set out in the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And in that NZE scenario, we see 3 main areas that will contribute towards doubling in roughly equal measure. So we see switching to more efficient fuels, in large part through electrification, which promises very radical improvements in energy efficiency compared to many conventional end uses. And we also see universal access to efficient clean cooking as those two together as one pillar. The second pillar is improving technical efficiency. So that's kind of enacting policies that we've seen to save energy through, whether that's renovations, more efficient appliances, more efficient vehicles, industrial processes. And finally, that third pillar that we see is behavior change and avoided demand as the third equally important contributor as well. And as I've already outlined, we've seen promising progress in many parts of the world in that direction. The good news for us, the second piece of good news that we wanted to give on the doubling story is that we know that many of the policies and technologies already exist, or at least are on the right course. So this figure shows a new piece of analysis we did. It's our IEA Energy Efficiency Policy Level Index that we developed for the market report. The figure needs a little bit of explaining, but basically everything above this green line at 100 here represents a policy or a technology that is already aligned with one of the net zero milestones for 2030. So above the green line means that something is on track for doubling. So we see from the green dots, for example, that which are best in class products for each sector, that in 2023 there are already products available that are doubling compliant. And we know that policies have to push consumer choices towards those products now. We also see that many of the policy thresholds that are in place are doubling compliant or moving in the right direction. So we see here for lighting and industrial motors, for example, that in some countries and regions, the threshold of those standards are above that green line, and we see movement in the right direction for cars as well. So we see in 2030 a number of proposed standards meet the doubling threshold. So why should we double? So we know that obviously, as we've mentioned, doubling is a critical step on the path to net zero by 2050, and therefore a key pillar in keeping the 1.5 degree goal within reach. From our modelling, we know that we have evidence that over 7 gigatons of CO2 emission savings are available. That's nearly half of the emission savings in 2030 that come as part of that net zero emissions scenario. And we see a range of wider benefits as well, that energy efficiency, stronger energy efficiency promises through lower energy bills across the world, but up to a third in advanced economies. We see 4.5 million more jobs than today, and we see enormous energy savings as well. So, we're very pleased with the progress that we've seen so far, and the task really now is to work with governments and with industries to unlock that investment, to get those policies in place, to drive towards a doubling target as quickly as possible. And a final slide from me as well, just to note that I mentioned the 8th Global Conference that we held in Versailles in June of this year, where 46 governments endorsed that goal initially. Just to mention that the 9th Global Conference, the IEA's 9th Global Conference on Energy Efficiency, will take place in Nairobi on the 21st to 23rd of May next year. And that will be another high-level gathering of business leaders, of political leaders, to work towards that goal of enacting the policies and investments that we need to get to doubling. Thank you very much. And just to say, if there's anything, it's a very large, the market report runs to about 120 pages. Obviously, we've been able to give you a snapshot of what's in there today. Do feel free to reach out to us for more information, and we would strongly recommend that you go and look at the market report on the IEA website as well. Thank you.